Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director at Word on Fire. Today, we are with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, you are in Philadelphia, aren't you? Welcome.
I'm in Philadelphia, Brandon. We're on the same coast for once.
Yeah, finally.
Usually when you and I talk, we're all the way across the country, but at least I'm a little closer to you now.
And what are you there for?
I'm here for the Cardinal Foley Lecture, which is a lecture at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia. And I was invited a long time ago by Bishop Tim Sr., who is the rector there and also an auxiliary bishop in Philly. And then Archbishop Chaput, of course, the Archbishop here, put some pressure on me to come and give this talk, which I'm happy to do. But it meant, it's flying across the country, which is always a little bit trying.
And I know you kind of have come down with a cold there, haven't you?
Yeah, maybe you hear it. I've got a little cough drop in my mouth, too. You might hear it clicking around because, I came down with something a couple days ago, and I was really sick. But I'm feeling much better now, but I just still all congested, and I want to make sure my voice hangs in there till tonight.
Well, we're planning to live stream the talk tonight, so by the time this episode of the podcast goes live, the event will be in the past, but you can watch the recap of this talk. So we'll make sure to have a link here on the podcast episode. Today, though, we're going to be discussing a recent event that was long hyped, long anticipated. It was a dialogue between you and William Lane Craig. Craig is one of the most popular Protestant apologists and debaters. He's probably best known for traveling the country, visiting college campuses, and debating prominent skeptics, atheists, and scientists. And so the Claremont College out there in California wanted to set up this event 500 years after the beginning of the Reformation, which brought together, again, arguably the best Protestant apologists with you, who many would probably consider one of the great Catholic apologists and evangelists. The day was sort of split up into two segments. The first segment was an afternoon symposium, lasted about 3 hours. I think there's probably about 20 or 25 scholars in the room, and you and Dr. Craig exchanged papers. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. And then the evening part was more of a stage dialogue. The two of you were joined on stage with a couple moderators, and it was more of a friendly Q&A type of a format. So I want to walk through the whole day and get your feedback on different points of it. But first of all, what was your overall sense of the event? How did you think it went?
I loved it. I've admired Craig for a long time. I've known about him since about 2007. And as you say, one of the great warriors on the cultural scene today in terms of the question of God and the new atheism. So I've admired him, watched him a lot, read him. I met him briefly several years ago at Mundelein, just as I was leaving to come out to the West Coast. So I didn't know him well personally, but we had a chance. In fact, you were there. We had breakfast together that day, and I got to know him personally a little bit. Then the day, to me, was fascinating. I'm an academic by background and training, so to have the opportunity to exchange those papers in the afternoon, to me, it was like water in the desert. I've done that for a while. Love that. And then the evening session I thought was just really positive, and I think good for people to see a Catholic and a Protestant sharing the stage and finding a lot of common ground in terms of our shared battle today, which is against a secularism that's become very aggressive. So as I think we both said in different ways, we could once again debate the 16th century, which is important. And I love those questions. They're important ones. But what's more pressing today is that we come together to talk about God, about Jesus Christ, about the moral life, about sense of purpose and all that, because we're up against a very powerful common enemy. So that to me was the leitmotif of the evening session.
So we're going to get to that evening session here more in a minute, but let's talk about that afternoon symposium. So a few months before the event, you both were invited to choose one particular topic of your interest and deliver a paper, short paper, maybe 15, 20 minutes. The other person would have a chance to respond, and then there would be roundtable discussion among the symposium attendees. Now, you chose the topic of divine simplicity, and I remember when we had breakfast with Dr. Craig the morning of the event, and he seemed very just confused and surprised that you would choose this topic, and in his typical gentlemanly demeanor at the end of breakfast, he said, "Hey, can I just say one more thing?" And he kind of leaned in and said, Now, I just want you to know that I'm going to disagree with you on this topic. I hope that's okay. And he said, of course it's okay. I expected that. Well, why'd you choose that topic, and why is it so important?
Well, I'll tell you, for me, anyone that's read my books or articles knows that this idea of God's simplicity, that in God essence and existence coincide, that God is not one being among many, but rather to be God is to be to be. I mean, all of that business that is rooted in Thomas Aquinas, and before Thomas Aquinas, in the patristic tradition, that this idea is a hinge idea for me. In fact, when I was doing the John Paul II chapel at Mundelein, and we had these new stained glass windows put in, and we had one of Thomas Aquinas, and I told the artist, I said, I want him to be holding the Summa, and I want him to be open to the clarification in the first part of the Summa where he mentions that in God, essence and existence coincide, because I think it's the distinctive quality of God, if you want. It's the way to name what makes God God. And then everything else in our Catholic theology flows in some ways from that idea. So to me, it's fundamental, it's basic, which is why I was so surprised now some years ago when I discovered that William Lane Craig, whom I deeply admire, I think he's dead right about arguing for God's existence and all that, disagreed strenuously with this idea, based on largely the speculation of Alvin Plantinga, who's a contemporary evangelical, theologian, philosopher rather than theologian. But I was just so taken by that and sort of puzzled by it that it led me to read a lot more in Craig. And I just thought, well, if we're going to talk about something, let's talk about, something I think is very important and you disagree with.
So in your paper, you sort of outlined what the divine simplicity means. It doesn't mean, by the way, that God is simple in the sense that he's simple to understand. I remember, Bishop, by the way, on a side note, in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, this is the one doctrine that he goes at full force, and he seems to suggest that he can disprove God, which has been classically understood to be divinely simple, because God's must be enormously complex to have designed this world, so therefore God doesn't exist. But anyway, you lay out the doctrine of divine simplicity. You anticipated some of the common objections, but how did William Lane Craig respond to it? What were some of his major objections to your paper?
Yeah, he enunciated a lot of things he's written about before, namely that it seems to be very unbiblical, that the God of the Bible seems to be a very definite being, who has ideas and moods and who acts and so on. And the divine simplicity can seem to give the impression that God is more like an abstract entity or like a Buddhist abyss or something. So there was a biblical objection that you can't reconcile this idea of God with the Bible. It's a kind of a technical point, but it seems to conflate all the attributes of God into one. And it's true that in Aquinas, to say that in God, essence and existence coincide means that God's intelligence, God's will, God's power, God's love, etc., all are really different ways of naming the same reality, which is the very essence of God. And so it seems to conflate these things, which are, at least by our common intuition, separate. Another problem, again, kind of a technical point, is that there's what they call the modal collapse. What they mean by that is, if you say God is simple, that to be God is to be, it seems to indicate a sort of necessitarianism, that God can't be any different than he is. So, for example, could you say, well, God might not have created? Well, yeah, okay, sure. God might have made a world different than the one he made. Yeah, I guess that's right. But see, in those cases, there would be worlds in which God remains God, but yet certain things are different. And that seems to indicate there's an accidental quality to God's way of being, see? And that makes God into a very big instance of the kind of beings that we experience all the time. So right now, you're in Orlando, you could be in California. I'm in Philadelphia, I could be in Chicago. So you and I remain the same, even though they're different modal possibilities. See? But if our essence and existence simply coincide, that sort of modal differentiation seems to be ruled out of court. Anyway, those are the standard objections that Craig would raise. And as I mentioned, they're grounded in the speculation of Alvin Plantinga, this contemporary Protestant philosopher. Now, let me say, I'll say a couple quick things, which I said at the symposium. First of all, the biblical problem. I think it's so often overlooked that Aquinas was a deeply biblical figure. His basic task as a professor of theology in medieval Paris was to preach, predicatio, preaching. Well, if you're a preacher, you have to be a Bible commentator, right? Because preachers preach on the Bible. And indeed, Thomas does lots of Bible commentaries, including that masterpiece on the Gospel of John. Well, if you're a Bible commentator, you're going to see all the questions, anomalies, conundrums, problems that arise from a careful reading of the Bible, right? And that leads you to raise what the medievals called questiones disputate, disputed questions. Well, I mean, it seems that God doesn't change because it says here, but elsewhere in the Bible, it certainly seems that God does change. So how do you handle that? It seems that we're free, but on the other hand, if God has complete providence, it seems that we can't be free, So theology arises out of biblical commentary. Then Thomas Aquinas wanted to summarize all those disputed questions into, at least for him, relatively readable and accessible material. And hence we get the famous summae, summaries of theology, right? My point there is most, even specialists in Aquinas, tend to read only the summaries, and they forget the very deep biblical background to all that he's saying. So that's part of the biblical thing. The identification of the properties is a very interesting problem in philosophy and theology. It is indeed true that for Aquinas, all the things that we name as different, for example, God's intelligence, his will, his power, his love, are really the same reality. They're just different ways of naming, according to our perception, the one divine essence. And the image to use here, I think it's an illuminating image, is the white light in a prism, right? Think of a white light. But when it passes through a prism, it breaks into a variety of colors. So think of finite consciousness as a kind of prism. So when the divine light shines on our finite consciousness, it breaks into a variety of colors. And we name them as, there's the divine intelligence, there's the divine will, the divine power. But they are, in fact, different ways of naming the white light, which is the divine essence. So that's a way to handle the problem of the properties. The modal problem is, again, even more subtle, and it depends upon an important distinction between the fact that the world is really related to God. That means, in Thomas's parlance, that the world is causally dependent upon God. But God is not really related to the world. It doesn't mean he's indifferent to the world. It means he's not causally dependent upon it, which further entails that even in a wide variety of modal differentiations, God's essence is not changed or modified. So would God still be God in the full sense if he had never created? Sure. Would God be God in the full sense if he had made a different world? Sure. Because God is not really related to the world in the sense of causal dependency. Okay. To get the full picture here, listen to the symposium, because these are all complex sort of philosophical issues. A lot of it, by the way, though, Brandon, hinges upon that 13th and 14th century shift from an analogical conception of being to a univocal conception of being in people like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. The Protestant reformers were very influenced by that thought world. And you see it. We saw it around the table that day in Claremont, is the Protestant thinkers almost all went with Craig along the univocal path. The Catholics all went with Aquinas along the analogical path. And that's, to me, was very interesting, very illuminating. So way behind, justification and sacraments and the Pope and all the 16th century things, there's this more fundamental demarcation between an analogical and a univocal conception of being. Anyway, so that's what I found so fascinating about the afternoon session.
I should have mentioned this earlier, that anyone listening to this episode who's intrigued by these discussions, you can go to wordonfireshow.com/WLC. So just William Lane Craig's initials, wordonfireshow.com/WLC. You can listen to the audio of this full symposium and see the subtle, nuanced discussion.
We have that up, Brandon, huh? The audio is available.
Yeah, we do. So we have the full video of the dialogue in the evening and then the audio of the symposium.
Good, because someone asked me about that recently, and I said, I'm not sure if the audio is up yet, but it is. So I'm glad to hear that. Good.
Now, I don't want to spend too much more time on the symposium. I want to shift gears now to the evening event, but just real quick, the second half of the symposium was Dr. Craig's opportunity to present a paper and get your thoughts on it. He decided to speak on the topic of the penal substitutionary view of the atonement. So maybe briefly, what is this and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it was fascinating to me. The roots are very deep. The idea is relatively simple, but what happens on the cross is that Jesus takes upon himself the punishment for sin that we deserved. So it was a substitutionary move that God the Father placed upon him, if you will, the penalty that we were supposed to pay. It was done out of love on the part of both the Father and the Son. So Craig is quite right that we shouldn't caricature this view as, the angerholic, father venting his frustrations on his son. That's a caricature. But the idea is that the Father, out of love, the Son, out of love, accepts this role as a way of satisfying the divine justice, right? So God is merciful indeed, but God's also just. So a price has to be paid for sin. A punishment is due to sin. We can't really pay it adequately, but the Son takes that punishment upon himself and thereby frees us from the effects of sin. So that's the theory of penal substitution. And Craig's been doing a lot of work on it in the last couple of years. I think he's preparing 2 books on the subject. So he laid out in kind of short compass this understanding.
Okay, let's turn now to the evening event. This is kind of the meat of the conversation. This was a big 2-hour event. There was around 1,500 people there in person, another 25,000 people watching online. There's been lots of conversation after the event about what the two of you said, what stuck out. I want to get your thoughts, though. Maybe we can walk through it piece by piece and hear what you thought. The first part of the evening event was on general strategies for evangelization. What stood out to me was just the amount of resonance between you and William Lane Craig. Is that kind of your take too?
Yeah, that's where I think where you saw that common ground that I talked about earlier. We both realize that we're up against a pretty aggressive secularism, that we have to draw on the intellectual traditions within Christianity. And then we have to do so in a very smart, confident way. We put our finger, because he's talked about a lot, I have too, on scientism. This really peculiar, the more you think about it, peculiar philosophical perspective that knowledge is reducible to what can be known through the physical sciences. It's a close cousin of materialism. All that's real is matter in motion. The problem, of course, is both scientism and materialism founder on the rocks of their own inconsistency, right? Because the one thing you can't determine on purely scientific grounds is that only scientific knowledge is admissible. I mean, where do you see that? Where do you experiment with that? How do you verify that through hypothesis and experimentation? I mean, so the theory itself is self-refuting, but it's been taken in, especially by young people, massively in our culture, and that's a real problem because then if you start speaking about something which can't be adjudicated scientifically, you are accused immediately of just trading in nonsense or trading in your own private emotions and so on. That there isn't a path that's both rational but non-scientific. It doesn't occur to people. And I argued, following Cardinal George here, that the collapse of philosophy has been a problem because philosophy is indeed a rational path, but non-scientific. And see, if you accept that, then the claims of religion to truth can be taken, seriously and not rejected out of hand. So we found a lot of common ground there.
You guys, both of you, I think, are well known for championing philosophy as this mediating discipline between faith and science. And particularly, both of you are champions of the philosophical arguments for God, of using these classical ways to demonstrate God's existence. I think that became especially clear during the next section of the dialogue when you took questions from the audience. So we welcomed questions from Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. I thought one of the most interesting questions was when each of you were asked, what's your favorite philosophical argument for God? But then interestingly, both of you gave one argument, and I want you to talk about that here briefly. But then you also both added that your favorite argument, the one you gave, you didn't think was the strongest argument or the one that gained the most traction with interlocutors. Talk about that exchange.
Yeah, we're wading into some troubled waters there on this question. It's complicated. I argued that the ontological argument is actually the most persuasive. And I think he probably defends Plantinga's version of it. And I wouldn't be quite as at home with that. But I defend a version that Paul Tillich articulated in the 20th century, grounded very much in Anselm, but not in line with the standard philosophical reading of it. But that's a story for another day. I think if you're really willing to enter into the philosophical complexity, that argument is the most compelling. Having said that, I said the one I get traction with people is the argument from contingency, which I've articulated many times. Craig did something similar, where didn't he say the Kalam argument that he's very famous for, which is a version of a cosmological argument, is the one he uses. But actually the most persuasive is the argument from morality, wasn't it? Of the objectivity of moral values. I think they're all useful. And see, when it comes to these arguments, I take the sort of ad hoc approach. I used to tell my students at the seminary, look, you're a soul doctor and you got to have a lot of different medicines in your medicine bag. Don't just go out with one thing, because people are different and they've got different types of minds and sets of experiences. And one argument that one person finds really compelling, someone else might just be puzzled by. Okay, you don't like that one? I got another one for you, And I think that's okay. So look, we just named 4 separate arguments, and they all conduce to the same point, but they appeal to the mind or the heart in different ways. So I think the good apologist today should have a lot of these things in his or her bag of tricks,
Another interesting exchange from the evening dialogue was a fact that the two of you discovered at breakfast earlier in the morning, which was that both of you were dramatically influenced early in your lives as young men by a single book. Talk about how a book sort of set the trajectory for each of you two.
Well, for me, I've told the story often about coming across Thomas Aquinas and his arguments for God's existence when I was just a kid of 14. But it was like, see, to me, that's like the Plato's cave thing. It was a way out of the cave for me. Cave isn't a bad place in Plato. I mean, you're looking at the shadows on the wall. It means you're in touch with reality, but at a pretty low level. And then something kicks open the door. I remember, I'm free floating here a little bit, but when Bruce Springsteen inducted Bob Dylan into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he said, the snare drum at the beginning of Like a Rolling Stone was like a foot kicking open the door of your mind. And I've always liked that image, because that reminds me of Plato's cave. And that song, of course, had a big impact on me too, that it kicks open something, that you enter into a higher world, a different world. And for me, that was the experience of these Aquinas arguments. And, why that kicked open the door to my mind, I don't know exactly. I think it was a grace. But for Craig, who was reading that book, wasn't it, you remember the author, Brandon, it was a Protestant author who was recovering arguments for God's existence. When Craig had been told by all his teachers that these have all been debunked, they don't work. And then he found this book that so persuasively presented the arguments that it changed his whole life.
Now let's talk about what I think was the most commented on part of the dialogue, and that was your discussion on beauty with Dr. Craig. So near the end of the dialogue, you each had a chance to ask each other questions. So not from the moderators, not from the audience, but you got to ask each other questions. And one of actually, I think it was the very first question he asked you. He said, you're well known for emphasizing beauty, for talking about leading with beauty in evangelization. But Dr. Craig said, I just don't see the role that beauty plays. Can you talk about that? And you gave some insights on how you think beauty can be used effectively, but it never seemed to land with him. What happened there? What do you make of that?
Yeah, it was interesting because that was the area that obviously we were totally unprepared for. I didn't know what he was going to ask me, and I have written and spoken a lot about beauty, and so when he raised that question, I thought, okay, this is kind of easy. I can respond to this. So I did, I think, in sort of that fundamental way that I often do, that the particular beautiful kind of opens you to the door of the beautiful itself. I didn't go into all the, James Joyce and Dante and Plato and all this business. But what I remember most vividly from that moment, we were sitting within, 5 feet of each other at that point, and looking into the face of this, exceptionally smart man, but seeing in his face what I would just call incomprehension. Like it just didn't resonate with him. But what I sensed at that moment was a basic Catholic Protestant split, because it is true that the Protestants, led by Luther, tended to move away from the beautiful as a route of access. They tended to see the beautiful as more of a distraction, the potential for idolatry always, in the forefront. And then I thought of Balthasar, who in his intense dialogue with Protestantism, especially in the person of Karl Barth, put this enormous stress on the beautiful. So his theological project, the Herrlichkeit, begins with beauty. So as I looked into Craig's face at that moment, that's what was occurring to me, was this really is a point of demarcation. And we'd have to do a lot of work on both sides, I think, to get to move forward,
I remember he kind of followed up and said, put some shoe leather on that for me, I think is a phrase he used. Like, show me concretely how this works. And you mentioned, I think, Brideshead Revisited. You mentioned the Gothic cathedrals and the rose windows. But I think the central confusion for Craig was he was assuming that what you were advocating was beauty as exclusively a form of evangelization, rather than beauty, in your words, as the arrowhead of evangelization, as something you use to draw them into the truth and the goodness of the faith.
I think that's right. But, think of like a young Cardinal Lustiger, who's a young Jewish kid. He was living with a Catholic family to protect him during the Holocaust. His mother died in the Shoah. And here's young Lustiger, who wanders into, it wasn't Paris, but another one of the great Gothic churches, and that converted him. And he's a guy that then read and understood the faith intellectually, but that was the moment that converted him. Or I might use the example of Paul Claudel at Notre Dame, right? That he kind of experienced the reversion to his Catholicism in the presence of the rose window. So I get that. I understand how that happens, and we can look to Plato and company to understand the dynamics of it. But I think that happens. The beautiful opens a door. It doesn't have to be an explicit, charismatic proclamation. It can be a more indirect experience of the sacred. So I think that is a Catholic Protestant demarcation.
We probably need to send Dr. Craig a copy of the Catholicism series, because I think that more than anything illustrates this principle at work. Because we hear from people all the time who say, I was, flipping through PBS or maybe EWTN or something, and I saw this beautiful series that drew me in. Yeah. And then I listened to what you said and I heard the truth and the goodness, but it was the beauty of the film and cinematography that first captured me.
Yes. And if you want to get sort of biblical about it, go back to the idea of glory in the Bible, especially in the Gospel of John. But then see behind that, you have the whole approach to what the Old Testament calls kabod. It can mean weightiness or glory of God, which resides in the temple. And read the Psalms now. When the psalmist goes into the temple, what's he struck by? Well, it's not propositional theology. It's the beauty of the temple. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord God of hosts, right? Jesus, who is himself now the embodiment, he's the new temple, is described over and over again as having doxa in Greek, right? The glory of God shining in the face of Christ, as Paul says. That's the biblical origin for this tradition. The transfiguration story is fundamental. There's a propositional element, if you want. He's talking to the law and the prophets and all that, but it's the beauty of it. The shining light, and that's a way to render doxa as well. The brightness, the shine. That's the biblical root for this whole long tradition of using the beauty as a way in.
Okay, finally, near the end of the dialogue, when it was your turn to ask Dr. Craig some questions, one of the things you said was you were struck early when you were reviewing his work at how he uses quite deftly the philosophical tradition when making these arguments for God, and that's often associated with Catholics more than Protestants. So, you said, why aren't you Catholic? And I remember you got a big round of applause just for asking him that question. What'd you think of Dr. Craig's answer?
I got it. I was sort of playing at that point. I think I asked him then in a more pointed way, what do you like best? What do you like least about Catholicism? And what he liked best, I resonated with, of course, is this long intellectual tradition that we've reverenced and we've kept. And he appreciates that. The Catholic Church has treasured these figures from, Justin the Martyr and Irenaeus all the way up to John Paul II. And so he appreciated that. What he didn't like, he was pretty clear. It was a lot of the classic 16th century problems. He mentioned Mary right up in front, as I remember. I don't think Mary's been assumed into heaven. He said he does believe in imputed righteousness. So back to those 16th century issues about justification. What else? Maybe one other of the classic Catholic Protestant divides. But I think he's pretty clear on that he's a real Protestant. And I'm okay with that. I'm glad that we can be frank about what separates us still. So I thought it was a good answer.
But when he was ticking off these various things he disagreed with, at one point he sort of put his hand over his face and said, there I go again talking about what we disagree about, and that's not why I'm here. You seemed a little more open to discussing that. He really didn't, and that seems to be at the heart of his mission, right?
Yeah, and that's okay, because we had said that was the purpose of that night. We didn't want it to devolve into a debate about the 16th century. Now, again, I've said that a couple times, but having said it, I like debates about the 16th century. I think it's okay if Christians enter into it. I'm against a sort of namby-pamby ecumenical approach that we've used for the past about 50 years, which is, look, we get along with each other, we like each other, we're not hurling condemnations. And don't get me wrong, I'm all in favor of that. I'm glad we're in that position. At the same time, I'm like, okay, I know we like each other, we get along, we're not going to hurl condemnations. But now, can we get into the issues? One of my ecumenical fantasies, what stays in my mind, is this image of the very young Hans von Balthasar, arguably the greatest Catholic theologian of the 20th century, being invited to Karl Barth's seminar on the Council of Trent. And so here's Barth, the greatest Protestant theologian of the century, inviting a young Balthasar to talk for a Protestant seminar to discuss the Catholic teaching of the Council of Trent. I thought, now that would be an interesting day, And I thought, may their tribe increase. May we be willing to continue doing that kind of work. So I'm in favor of what I call ecumenism 2.0, that we get beyond just, we get along, which is great. But let's get into the issues. I'm okay with that.
Well, again, to watch the entire evening dialogue and to listen to the academic symposium, just go to wordonfireshow.com/WLC. We want to take a brief moment here to thank all the organizers of that great event, especially the Claremont Center for Reason, Religion, and Public Affairs, led by Joe Bissett, Edward Fazer, Dr. Stephen Davis. We, of course, want to thank Dr. William Lane Craig and Reasonable Faith for joining us for such a great event, and thanks to everybody else who helped make it successful. Okay, it's time now for our regular question from one of our listeners. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, just visit askbishopbarron.com and you can record your question on any device. Today we have a question from Jeffrey, who asks Bishop what you think of the work of a well-known theologian. So here's Jeffrey's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Jeffrey from Edmonton, Alberta. Recently, I've been reading, and I have been very impressed by the work of Eastern Orthodox theologian and philosopher David Bentley Hart, particularly his translation of the New Testament and his book, Atheist Delusions. I was wondering if, as a bishop in the Roman Catholic Church, you have any assessment of Dr. Hart's work, and particularly where maybe you think it falls short of the whole truth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. We'd have to do a whole show or series of shows to answer that adequately. I have great admiration for David Bentley Hart. I've been reading him for years, both in the pages of First Things, and I've read his books as well. Love him on the issue of God. I think there's hardly anyone better at naming what I was naming earlier in this episode, the divine simplicity, for want of a better term, what makes God distinct from any being in the world. And see, he uses that quite correctly, it seems to me, to counter the sort of silly, superficial objections of the new atheists. So he's really good on the new atheist stuff and very good on the issues of God. I like what he does there with even other religions. He's got such a capacious mind and is able to see links between some of our own theistic musings and then thought patterns from the East. So all that is really good. I also, he's an advocate of universalism, coming up out of an Eastern Orthodox perspective. As people perhaps know that I'm an advocate of the Balthasar position, that one may hope that all people will be saved. It's not the same as knowledge. It's not a universalism in that sense. So I'm open to his speculations along those lines. I think what's really helpful is how he shows the Bible is more complicated than simply certain passages from Paul that were then used by Augustine to say that the vast majority of people are not saved. He's completely right, it seems to me, at bringing forward a lot of the far more optimistic, far more universalist passages in the New Testament. So I've liked that about him. The New Testament, I just got it, and I've been looking at it, but I shouldn't comment because I really haven't read it carefully enough. I did read N.T. Wright's somewhat negative review of it. Now, I'm no great, philologist or expert in Koine Greek and all that. So I wouldn't presume to comment on those details, but he's someone I like and admire very much.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Again, if you'd like to listen to Bishop Barron's dialogue with William Lane Craig, just visit wordonfireshow.com/WLC. We'll have a link to that on the podcast page for this episode. And please tell a friend about this show. We love hearing from people who say, I heard about this from my friend or my priest or someone in my parish. So please share it around. We'd love to expose even more people to the great work of Bishop Barron. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.